The man's name was Caleb, and he stood like a rock in the shifting dust of Miller's General Store. The air was thick with the scent of dried beans, salt pork, and the faint, sharp smell of gossip. Mr. Miller, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, was holding court, his voice booming over the counter. He was talking about prospects, about the fresh crop of girls reaching marrying age, girls with wide hips and clear eyes, untouched by hardship. He gestured with a fat thumb toward Caleb. A man like you, strong, with a good plot of land, you need a good start. A clean slate. Young Mary Ann, her father would see you right. A few of the townswomen, clustered by the fabric bolts, tittered into their hands. Their eyes, sharp as needles, flicked over to the corner where Martha stood. She was trying to count out her meager coins for a small sack of flour, her shoulders drawn in as if to ward off a physical blow. The boy beside her, Sam, a waif she'd taken in when his own kin had passed, clung to the rough fabric of her skirt. The whispers followed the glances. Barren. Cursed by her first husband's passing. A widow with nothing but a broken-down homestead and another mouth to feed. Martha's face was a mask of strained neutrality, but a faint flush crept up her neck. She pushed the coins across the worn wood of the counter. Caleb had been silent, inspecting a new axe handle, his presence a quiet weight in the room. He turned then. His movements were never hurried, always deliberate. He did not look at Mr. Miller or the snickering women. He walked past them all, his worn boots making a soft, rhythmic scuff on the floorboards. He stopped in front of Martha. She looked up, startled, her grey eyes wide with distrust. He said nothing. He simply reached down, his large, calloused hand closing around the top of the flour sack. He lifted it as if it were nothing. "I will carry this," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. It was not a question. It was a statement. The store fell silent. The tittering stopped. Mr. Miller's jaw hung slightly agape. Martha stared at him, her lips parted to protest, but no words came. He simply turned and walked toward the door, expecting her to follow. He had not offered charity, he had offered an alliance, a silent rebuke to the entire room. And in that one simple, grounding action, a story had begun, a story that would be told not in words, but in mended fences and quiet glances across a darkening prairie. Martha's homestead was a testament to stubborn survival, a small, grey scar on the vast, unforgiving landscape. The wind, a constant and weary traveler, whispered through the cracks in the cabin walls and rattled the one good shutter on the window. The fence surrounding her small plot of land was a broken spine, posts rotted at the base and leaning at sad, defeated angles. Her late husband had built the place with hope, but sickness had taken him before he could truly tame the land, leaving Martha with a legacy of unfinished work and the heavy weight of the town's pity, which had long since curdled into scorn. Each day was a litany of chores that would have broken a lesser spirit. She split wood with a dull axe, her thin arms straining with each swing. She hauled water from a well whose pump groaned in protest. She tended a small, dusty garden, coaxing meager vegetables from the dry soil. The boy, Sam, was her shadow, a silent, watchful presence. He was small for his age, with eyes that seemed to hold the sorrow of a much older man. He gathered kindling, he pulled weeds, his small hands mimicking her own tireless movements. They were an island, the two of them, their world defined by the perimeter of that broken fence. Caleb would ride by some days, on his way to or from town. He never stopped. He never waved. He would simply slow his horse, his gaze sweeping over the property. He was not spying, he was assessing. He saw the way she braced her shoulder before swinging the axe. He saw the patch on the roof where she had tried to stop a leak with tar and prayer. He saw the fierce, protective set of her jaw as she watched Sam play with a stick in the dust. He saw a resilience that was as stark and as beautiful as the land itself. He saw a woman who did not ask for help, a woman who had forgotten how. He saw the broken fence not as a sign of failure, but as an invitation for a man who knew how to build, a silent problem waiting for a silent solution. His observations were not born of pity, but of a deep, unspoken recognition. He saw strength, and strength, he knew, deserved to be fortified. He arrived as the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of orange and bruised purple. There was no knock, no call from the road. Martha was on her knees in the garden, pulling stubbornly at a deep-rooted weed, when the shadow fell over her. She looked up, shielding her eyes with a dirt-streaked hand. Caleb stood there, a toolbox in one hand, a bundle of freshly cut cedar posts over his other shoulder. He had not come from the road, but across the fields, a direct and purposeful approach. She rose slowly, her body tense, her hand instinctively moving toward the small hatchet she kept near the woodpile. It was not a weapon, not really, but its weight was a comfort. Sam, who had been scratching patterns in the dirt, scurried behind her skirts. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice flat, betraying none of the alarm that fluttered in her chest. Caleb said nothing for a long moment. He simply let the heavy post slide from his shoulder to the ground with a solid thud. He then gestured with his chin toward the pathetic line of the old fence. "Fence needs mending," he said, the word spare, as if he begrudged the air they used. It was an observation, a fact as plain as the setting sun. He was not asking for permission. He walked to the nearest broken post and gave it a shove with his boot. It collapsed in a small cloud of dust and rotten wood. He looked at the ruin of it, then back at her. The challenge was silent, implicit. She could send him away, stand on her pride while the coyotes crept closer to her chickens at night. Or she could let him work. She watched him, her mind a whirl of suspicion and a desperate, weary need. He did not wait for her answer. He opened his toolbox, the metallic click of the latch echoing in the quiet evening. He selected a post-hole digger and began to work, the rhythm of his labor steady and powerful. He was a force of nature, as elemental as the wind and the earth. Martha stood frozen for a time, watching the muscles in his back bunch and release, then she slowly lowered her hand from the hatchet and returned to her weeding, the two of them working in a shared, charged silence. The last post was set as twilight bled the color from the world. The new fence stood straight and true, a clean, strong line against the darkening prairie. It was more than a barrier, it was a statement of order, of protection. Caleb packed his tools with the same deliberate economy of motion he applied to everything. He did not look toward the house, did not seem to expect anything. He had done the work he came to do. Martha watched him from the porch, the screen door a flimsy barrier between them. A war was being fought inside her, between the ingrained habit of self-reliance and a foreign, unsettling flicker of gratitude. To let the act pass without acknowledgement felt like a failing. To offer payment felt like an insult. She turned and went inside, her movement stiff. She ladled a portion of the thin rabbit stew she had made for herself and Sam into a bowl. She added a heel of dark bread, a meager offering by any standard. When she came back out, he had his toolbox in hand and was turning to leave. "Wait," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He stopped and turned. She held out the bowl. "It is not much." He looked from the bowl to her face, his expression unreadable in the gloom. He walked back to the porch, took the offering from her hands, and sat on the top step. She hesitated, then sat on the other end of the step, a chasm of splintered wood and silence between them. He ate slowly, methodically, as if giving the food his full consideration. Sam peeked from behind the door, his eyes wide. Caleb saw the boy and gave a slow, deliberate nod in his direction, a simple acknowledgement that was neither friendly nor threatening. It was just a fact, "I see you." When he was finished, he placed the empty bowl on the step beside him. "Thank you," he said. The formal address was a strange thing between them, a recognition of the distance he was carefully maintaining. He stood, picked up his tools, and walked away into the darkness, leaving behind the scent of fresh-cut cedar and a silence that felt heavier, more meaningful, than the one that had existed before the mended fence was a declaration. When Martha rode into town the next Saturday, her wagon rattling behind her old mare, she could feel the change in the air. The gazes that followed her were no longer tinged with dismissive pity, they were sharp with suspicion and a kind of resentful curiosity. The women who gathered near the mercantile fell into a hushed, urgent whispering as she passed, their words like the rustle of dry, venomous snakes. They saw the straight line of new cedar posts as a brand, a claim. Caleb had done more than fix a fence, he had publicly chosen a side. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife and the town's self-appointed moral compass, did not even bother to lower her voice. As Martha tied her horse to the hitching post, Mrs. Gable's words cut through the morning air, clear and cruel. Some women have no shame. A barren widow, taking a man's labor when she's got nothing proper to offer him in return. Her companions tittered, a flock of crows picking at a fresh wound. Perhaps she's found a new kind of crop to harvest, one of them added, her voice thick with insinuation. Martha's hands tightened on the reins, her knuckles turning white. She could feel the heat rising in her face, a wave of humiliation and rage. She wanted to turn, to scream, to throw their hypocrisy back in their smug faces. But she did not. She had learned long ago that to fight their words was to give them power. Instead, she lifted her chin a fraction higher, her back ramrod straight. She turned and lifted Sam down from the wagon, his small, warm hand finding hers. He had heard them. She could feel the tremor in his grip. She squeezed his hand gently, a silent promise of protection she wasn't sure she could keep. She walked past the women, her gaze fixed straight ahead, her steps measured and deliberate. She would not let them see her break. She would not give them the satisfaction. But their judgment settled on her shoulders like a heavy shroud, and she knew that Caleb's simple act of kindness had come at a cost that she, not he, would be forced to pay in the currency of whispers and sidelong glances. The well pump chose the hottest week in July to die. One morning, the familiar rhythmic squeak of the handle was replaced by a dry, grating gasp. No water came, only a puff of dust. For Martha, it was a catastrophe. The garden, already struggling under the relentless sun, would wither. The chickens and the old mare would go thirsty. Her own small stores of water would not last long. For 2 days, she fought it. She took the mechanism apart as best she could, following the ghost of her late husband's instructions. Her hands, already calloused, were rubbed raw and bloody by stubborn, rusted bolts. Her face was smudged with grease and frustration. She poured her precious drinking water down the pipe, hoping to prime it, but it was a useless gesture. The sun beat down, and with every failed attempt, a piece of her fierce independence crumbled into despair. On the evening of the second day, as she sat defeated on the well cover, her head in her hands, he appeared. He walked out of the heat haze, carrying a heavy canvas roll of tools. He moved with the same unhurried purpose as before, as if he had been summoned not by a cry for help, but by the land's own distress. This time, her protest was a mere whisper. "I can fix it." He did not contradict her. He simply looked at the disassembled parts laid out on the dusty ground, then at her bleeding hands. He knelt and began to work. He moved with a mechanic's grace, his large hands surprisingly deft as he diagnosed the problem. A worn leather gasket and a cracked plunger. He worked for hours, through the sunset and into the deep, star-strewn night, by the light of a single lantern. She watched him, her earlier frustration replaced by a quiet awe. When he was nearly finished, he motioned for her to come closer. Using gestures and a few spare words, he showed her the inner workings, pointing to the parts he had replaced, showing her how to tighten a specific nut to prevent a future jam. He was not just fixing her well, he was teaching her, empowering her. When at last he worked the handle, the sound of the squeak was followed by a beautiful, miraculous gush of clear, cold water. She brought him a dipper, and he drank deeply. It was a shared victory, a bond forged in rust and water, and the silent acknowledgement of a burden too heavy to bear alone. Sam had been a ghost in his own small life, a boy who had learned that silence was safety. He orbited the world of the adults, a watchful satellite, his voice a rarity. He observed Caleb with a solemn, unnerving intensity. He saw the way the man's hands could fix anything, the way he moved without wasted effort, the way his silence was not empty, but full of a quiet, solid strength. To the boy, Caleb was not a man, he was a kind of reliable magic. One afternoon, while Caleb was on a ladder, methodically replacing a loose shutter that had been banging in the wind, Sam approached. His small feet made no sound in the dust. He stood at the base of the ladder for a long time, simply watching. Caleb knew he was there but did not acknowledge him, giving the boy the space to find his courage. Finally, Sam held up his hand. In his palm was a small, crudely carved bird, whittled from a piece of scrap pine. Its wings were uneven, the shape clumsy, but it had been made with a child's painstaking care. It was an offering, a piece of his own quiet world given freely. Caleb paused his work. He looked down at the boy, then slowly descended the ladder. He knelt, bringing himself down to Sam's level. He did not smile or offer any easy praise. He simply held out his own large hand, and Sam placed the wooden bird into his palm. Caleb turned it over and over, studying it with the same seriousness he would give a faulty piece of machinery. He saw the effort, the intention. He looked at Sam, a long, direct gaze that held no judgment, only acceptance. Then, Caleb reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small, perfectly smooth river stone, worn grey and cool to the touch. He pressed it into the boy's hand. It was an exchange, a treaty signed without a single word. Martha watched the entire interaction from the kitchen window, a dishcloth clutched in her hand, her breath caught in her throat. He had not tried to win the boy over with sweets or false cheer. He had met Sam on his own terms, in the language of silent, meaningful things. And in that moment, she felt a crack appear in the wall around her heart, a tiny fissure letting in an unexpected and terrifying light. The arrival of the preacher was as inevitable as a winter storm. Reverend Gable came on a Sunday afternoon, his black coat a somber blot against the bright, sun-bleached landscape. He was driven by his wife's persistent nagging and a genuine, if misguided, sense of duty. He saw it as his mission to save Martha's soul from the path of impropriety. Caleb was there, on the roof, securing the patch he had made weeks earlier, making it permanent. He saw the preacher's buggy approaching but did not stop his work. The Reverend dismounted, clearing his throat with a sound of great importance, and approached Martha, who was sitting on the porch shelling peas. "Mrs. Reed," he began, his tone a cloying mix of paternal concern and stern admonition. "The good people of this town are concerned. A woman in your position, a widow, allowing an unmarried man such access. It creates talk. It sullies your reputation, and by extension, the good name of our community." His words were couched in piety, but the message was clear: she was a disgrace. Martha's hand stilled over the bowl of peas. She felt the familiar shame and anger rise within her. Before she could form a reply, a shadow fell over them. Caleb was coming down the ladder. He moved without a sound, his feet landing softly in the dust. He did not stop at the bottom of the ladder. He walked over and stood beside Martha's chair. He was not between them, not acting as a physical shield, but beside her. A partner. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at the preacher. He did not speak. He did not glower or threaten. He simply stood, a silent, unmovable fact. His presence was a bulwark, a solid wall of quiet defiance. The preacher, who had a sermon prepared for a shamed and solitary woman, found himself utterly disarmed. He stammered, his arguments about propriety and gossip sounding hollow and foolish in the face of this united, silent front. Caleb's stillness seemed to absorb the preacher's words, rendering them powerless. After a few more sputtering attempts to regain his authority, Reverend Gable retreated, mumbling about prayer and forgiveness, and drove away in a cloud of righteous dust. Caleb had not said a single word, but he had spoken volumes. He had claimed his place beside her, and in doing so, had silenced the town's most powerful voice. The homestead was whole again. The fence was a straight, protective line. The well gave clean, cold water. The roof was sound against the coming rains, and the shutters were secure against the wind. The list of necessary repairs had dwindled to nothing. Caleb's reasons for being there had run out. He stood on the porch with Martha as the last light of day faded from the sky. An uneasy quiet stretched between them, heavier than any of the silences they had shared before. It was the silence of an ending, or perhaps, a beginning. He had been looking out at the horizon, at the endless sea of prairie grass, but now he turned his gaze to the house, to the solid, tangible results of his labor. "There is talk in town," he said, his voice low, stating a fact rather than an accusation. "About you. About me. Martha braced herself, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She expected an apology, a farewell, a severing of this strange, unspoken connection they had formed. He continued, his eyes still on the house. They say a man needs a young wife. A fruitful one. One to give him sons to carry on his name. He recited the town's wisdom like a lesson learned by rote, his tone devoid of emotion. Then he finally looked at her. His gaze was not soft or romantic, it was direct, intense, and deeply serious. It was the look of a man who had weighed all his options and had come to an unshakable conclusion. I do not need a girl, he said, the words coming slowly, each one chosen with care. I need a woman with roots of her own. One who knows how to stand when the wind blows. His hand, calloused and strong, lifted and gestured not to her, but to the entire homestead, the mended fence, the solid roof, the boy who now slept soundly inside. This is a home, he said. It is not finished. It needs a family. It was not a declaration of love, not in the way the poets wrote about it. It was a proposal of something far more real and durable. It was an offer of partnership, a recognition of her strength, a promise to build a future not on the flimsy ground of passion, but on the solid bedrock of mutual respect and shared survival. The seasons turned. The harsh sun of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn, and then to the stark, clean silence of winter. Life on the homestead found a new rhythm, a quiet, three-part harmony. A small, sturdy addition was being built onto the side of the cabin, its new pine frame smelling sharply of resin and promise. Caleb worked on it each day, his hammer blows a steady, reassuring heartbeat against the vast emptiness of the prairie. He was no longer a visitor. His horse grazed in the pasture, and his few belongings now rested inside the home he was helping to expand. Martha moved with a lightness that had been absent for years. The tight, defensive set of her shoulders had softened. She hung laundry on a line stretched between the house and a new, solid post, the white sheet snapping in the wind like victory flags. She would pause in her work, her hands still, and watch him. She watched the sure, economic way he moved, the focus in his eyes as he measured a piece of lumber. He would often feel her gaze and look up, and their eyes would meet across the yard. No grand words passed between them. A simple nod from him, a small, almost imperceptible smile from her. It was enough. It was everything. Sam was no longer a shadow. He was a boy transformed, his silence broken by occasional questions and laughter that sounded like a long-forgotten melody. He followed Caleb everywhere, his small hands trying to imitate the man's work, passing him wooden pegs or holding the end of a board. He had found his anchor. The town's whispers had not disappeared entirely, but they had faded, becoming a distant, irrelevant noise, like the buzz of flies on a hot day. The world inside the mended fence was the only one that mattered. They had not filled the silence with chatter, they had filled it with life. They had built a family, not from the prescribed plans of society, but with the materials they had at hand, two broken souls, a forgotten child, and the shared, stubborn will to create something true and lasting in a world that had offered them nothing.